Fred, thanks for sitting down with me today. Appreciate your time.
Yeah, pleasure to do so.
Excellent. Fred, you've been on both sides of the plant breeding industry. You spent a number of years with Seminis, spent a number of years now at UC Davis. From your perspective, what do you see as some fundamental keys to keeping the funding in places where we need it in the plant breeding business?
Well, this is a major critical issue. I think this is really a public-private problem or an opportunity or a situation. I think it has to be looked at from both standpoints here. I think from the private sector, they need to do a couple of things. One is to give some direct support in terms of funding research or funding students. They can also fund some internships and have a lot like that. The other, I think, is to make sure that they talk with the governmental representatives and the people that are actually responsible for the funding to make sure they understand the importance of plant breeding, that it's a long-term activity that needs to have funding for continuity to make it go. So I think they really have a big responsibility to work in a partnership to make sure that there is funding for the future.
How do we get that message out? Any thoughts on, I mean, you've been doing it for years, but any thoughts on how we can further get that message out?
It's really difficult because I think sometimes plant breeding is not well understood. It's defined in a number of different ways. The most obvious thing is when we have a new variety that comes out that really does make a difference. It's a higher yielding variety. In some cases it's better flavor, it's better shelf life. These are important things. But I think the whole idea of improved crops, and I think in the U.S. we're kind of spoiled because we know that there's always been a lot of productivity here and production is high. So we need to do a better job of explaining to people what plant breeding is, why it's important, what it does. It delivers new genetics that makes things possible for new ideas and new productivity. It's an education, and make sure we have to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. You've been involved in the seed industry and plant breeding for a number of years now.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about what does industry need to do to continue to embrace innovation?
Well, I think the whole idea of innovation and being innovative comes from the atmosphere in a particular organization. So I think you have to create this idea that you want new things, you want innovation, that they're valuable, and I think you have to look to all the people working in that company. And it's not just the top group, or it's not just a group of people, of scientists, for example, that are being inventive. Everybody has good ideas, and I think the best ideas usually come from the grassroots. When I was involved in management in seed companies, one of the things that I tried to get people to do was to bring new ideas or to come up with new ideas and talk about it. I think it's easy sometimes to talk yourself out of a new idea. You come in and you say, I got this really new, great idea, and they start talking about it, and pretty soon it's like, well, I don't know if it's so good. If it was so good, somebody else would have thought about it. And pretty soon they've talked themselves out of a good idea. I tried to stop them and say, listen, let's talk about it. I want to hear about it. The other thing would oftentimes be, I've got this good idea, but you probably won't want to hear it because it's too expensive. And I'd say, don't worry about that. Let's talk about the idea. If it's a great idea, it'll probably make a lot of money, and the cost won't amount to anything. So you have to make sure that you're welcome, you're open, the people that, and you have to value that from the standpoint of the whole research organization.
Not necessarily easy to do, but
that's
critically
right.
important.
And the other thing is, I think there needs to be some incentives. Sometimes those are monetary incentives. Sometimes it's that they proceed up the chain of profession faster. It might simply be a recognition, but we do have to recognize that and make sure that they get full credit for it.
Agreed. You officially retired in 2010.
Mm-hmm, correct.
Not your typical retirement.
Right.
You've been out and about. you've been conducting plant breeding work in, I got Nigeria, Somalia, Honduras, Brazil.
Well, that was in the early stages. I did that early on, and I think that kind of carried over because I've always been involved in international activities as well as national and regional things. I've enjoyed seeing people in different parts of the world and working with diversity. And I think that's one of the great things about a job in plant breeding is that you're not tied to one location. You have an opportunity, if you want, to travel a lot, to see different people, to make an impact in many cases. Early on when I was in the university, and I was at the University of Wisconsin before I came to UC Davis, I was involved in a lot of graduate training and graduate education, and the diversity there was quite wide as well. It was students from all around the world. And I think it made me understand better what it's like to live in a different society, to be a part of a different society. So I've gained a lot from the people I've worked with, students as well as other professionals. But basically there's the same needs out there. They're looking for ways to have a better living, to make better for their family. So those things are pretty constant regardless of what society you're in.
So you'd encourage your colleagues in this business to get out and experience that globally as much
Absolutely.
as possible.
Yeah. And it really is a global, it's like everything, they're global businesses now. It's you may think that, well, I have this small company here that's very local, very regional, but you are impacted by things that are happening globally. And you may not be a direct competitor in that, but you're going to have some influence. So it's good to have an idea of what's happening in a global situation.
I know you've also done plenty of work in understanding the educational needs for plant breeders and prepping young folks for getting into plant breeding. What would your analysis be of the current situation that we're in right now? Do we have enough plant breeders coming into the system? Do we have enough potential plant breeders coming into the schools? And what do we need to do to make sure that we're on the right path?
Well, you're right. Since I've, probably the last decade or so, I've really taken a lot more interest in education. While I was in the university, that was a big part of my appointment, was teaching in the classroom and also graduate education. But then when I went into business for a while, I didn't work with that quite as directly. But then since I've had more time, I've spent time on looking at ways that we can enhance education. And not just from the standpoint of formal education, but I want to think in terms of lifelong education. A plant breeder, he or she may have their degree and they go out and start working. Pretty soon, if they're not careful, they become obsolete. So you really have to think in terms of lifetime education. So I've begun to look at it in that respect as well. Back to your original question about new people coming in and the supply of plant breeders. I think that's coming along pretty well. I think a decade ago, we weren't nearly as optimistic. From what I understand and talking to some of the people at the universities where there's a lot of graduate education going on, the supply coming in is pretty good. We're seeing good pools of applicants. The applicants are quite good, both from the U.S. and from outside, which is important to think in terms of globally. I think the other thing that's very optimistic now, or it looks pretty good, is that most of the students that are finishing now have job opportunities when they get out very soon afterwards. So that sends a powerful message. Word of mouth is very important. People are talking to their young colleagues that they've been in classes with, and they're saying, I'm really getting good job offers and good opportunities. That's going to go a long ways. It's one of the most exciting times now is in plant breeding, plant genetics. With the genomics tools, with the kinds of things that we have with analytical, with the big data sets, the analysis, it's really an exciting time. So I think there's a lot of challenge for people that are interested in the life sciences and the agricultural sciences. So I'm very optimistic. I think the supply looks good. The talent level is great. A really good young people. The group that we're seeing here is really impressive. They're giving good presentations. They're learning how to present themselves and become real professionals on this. So I'm pretty pleased with what I'm seeing now.
Nice. Well, and if this is any indication, the group that's here, then we're in pretty good hands.
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely.
One of the areas that I've been working a lot with is this whole idea of education in essentially a total package, and not just the formal education, but things that go on to educate people, like I said before, lifelong education, and courses and webinars and so forth that enhance the things that they need to do to stay up and be top-notch professionals. There's a lot going on in that area, and I think that's a new area, a new thing that we've seen recently. It's not just the traditional sources now, but a lot of other things that people are using for self-directed learning as well.
Right. Your work didn't focus on what I would call the traditional crops.
That's true,
You,
yeah.
you worked in cowpea,
Right.
common bean, tomatoes, stone fruit, tree fruit rootstocks. As we try to figure out how to feed 9.5 billion people for 2050,
Yeah.
you've had your hand on a lot of different zones. Where do you see the biggest productivity gains that we're going to need coming from?
Yeah. Well, I think we have to think in terms of productivity. There's no question about that. We need higher yields. I think along with that, we need to make sure that the quality of the product is also enhanced as well. In the past, I think we sometimes forgot about the nutritional value. We may have forgotten or not emphasized enough the flavor, the shelf life, the holding capacity. And I think that was a shortcoming, because it's one thing to have a lot of production, but if you can't store that, if you can't ship that, if you can't use it, and then if it doesn't have the nutritive value for the consumer, we haven't done as good a job as we should. Those, I think, are going to be the key things on productivity and how we're going to feed a larger population. We have the tools now with the genetics and genomics to understand a lot of the basic functions that we only could dream about before. So now we can manipulate these things with a higher degree of precision and accuracy than we ever could. So I think the time is really here when we can do a much better job of looking at crop improvement in total, and not just more yield, which is important, but to deal with questions about how can we have productivity on marginal lands, for example. We may have challenges from environmental swings that we're seeing. So we're going to have to be really creative and use all those things to be productive enough to feed the world's population. Yeah.
Fred, thanks again for sitting down with me.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.